Hey everyone, thanks for stopping by. So today, as you can see, I'll be inking this dragon, and I'm doing a little voiceover work because the audio on the original videos did not turn out the way that I wanted. So before I get started with the narration here, I just wanted to mention that for those of you watching this on YouTube, this will be a shortened version. If you'd like to see the full-length version and see me ink this dragon all the way through, you can check out the description box below. There's a link to my Patreon, patreon.com/Luke.Ink. And most of the videos that you find here on YouTube, I do a extended version for my patrons over on Patreon. So go ahead and check that out if you're interested. And I'll get back to narrating my work here. So as you can see, I've got this dragon that I've penciled in. I just used a kind of a plain old mechanical pencil. I think the lead was HB. And when it comes to using layout pencils, I'm not too fussy. I'll use anything from an old number 2 pencil to just have a drawer of miscellaneous art pencils, and I just look for something that's not going to be too dark on the paper. The main quality that I look for in pencils is that I can erase it well, because I'm just using it to get the rough idea down on paper, and then after the ink is dry, I just come through and erase all that pencil out. So the paper I'm using is Canson watercolor paper, 140 pound. That's, I believe, the same paper that I use in most of my videos on here. It's just a nice kind of mid-range. It's a good quality, but not too expensive. I think you can pick up a tablet, depending on the size of the paper. You can get a tablet of, I think this is 9 by 12 inch, and you can pick it up for about 15-20 bucks. And it doesn't break the bank, but it's pretty good quality. And the ink I'm using is Speedball Super Black, the same ink that I'm usually using in these videos. The pen nib is a Leonard 111, I believe, and it's a nib that I don't normally use. Once in a while I like to just rummage through my drawer of nibs and pull out something that I've not used in a long time, or maybe never have used. And this one works pretty good. I think I do switch it up here in a few minutes because it's more ideal for detail work, at least the type of inking that I do. And I keep on going with it for a few minutes, but eventually I'll trade it up. So the dragon's looking pretty good. I used, when I was coming up with the layout for this dragon, the ideas, I looked through a book of reptile photography that I have, that I use quite often for inspiration. You know, after you draw something for a long time, my dragons tend to kind of look similar, because if you're just drawing from your head, you tend to, after a while, kind of revert back to the same. So every once in a while I like to pull that book out and just look at pictures of crocodiles, alligators, snakes, turtles, lizards, and those creatures all have really interesting skin textures and scale patterns that you can use to just give you some ideas and maybe go in a direction that you usually don't. So I really recommend using photographs or real life for inspiration, really whenever possible. I know a lot of people have asked me in the past if I use reference materials, and absolutely, yeah. I think all the great masters of the past used life references, certainly. And if photography had been around, I'm 100% certain that those old masters would have used photographs as well. And usually I'm not even something like snake scales or lizard skin patterns. I'm not really going to take it and reproduce it exactly as I see it. I'm just getting ideas, and then I kind of riff on it, go my own direction. So, something I encourage you to do as well. And sometimes just looking at those pictures, if you have no ideas of what to draw, just looking at those pictures can be inspiring. So, yeah, photography, really a fun way to vary it up and, you know, get some cool new ideas for your work. It's coming along pretty good here. As you can see, I'm mainly doing outlining work at this stage of the game. Because of the style of inking that I'm doing on this particular drawing, I can go through and just more or less outline it and then fill in the outlines with my inking later on. So I believe the actual reference materials that I used for this, it was a python. It was either a python or a viper or a little of both for some of the scales, particularly around the mouth. And also there's a little bit of lizard thrown in there as well, some kind of lizard. And one thing I noticed looking at this is I tend to always put the eye position is critical for me, like when I'm doing a layout. And I like to position the eye a little bit more than halfway, like between the tip of the snout and the back of the mouth. See where the eye is? It's a little bit past the halfway point from the front. And that tends to be where I put it. So here you can see I've switched over to the Hyro 41 nib because now I'm laying down some thicker lines, and that Leonard 111 just wasn't doing the trick. Even with the Hyro 41, as thick a line as that one will put down, I'm still, if you watch closely, you'll still see me doubling up on the lines. I'll go over the line and then go over it again. See, I've got a little ink smudge there. I put my hand down in the wet ink and I left those little marks. But that's not really an issue because you can just go right back over. I believe I just incorporated that right back into the drawing. Anytime you make a little mistake like that, don't sweat it. Just keep on going with the drawing because you can always go back. You can either use white gouache paint to cover it up, or you can scrape it out with a razor blade, which is another trick. But more often than not, you can actually just, unless it's a huge ink spill, usually you can just incorporate that mark right into, like I'm doing right there. You can incorporate it right back into the drawing, and if you didn't know that it was there, you'd never see it. People ask me all the time if I make mistakes when I draw, and well, there's proof. I make mistakes on pretty much every drawing, and you just have to get really good at hiding your mistakes or working with your mistakes. As you can see, I'm just putting a lot of ink down here on the underside of this dragon's throat. I'm just going over those lines, making very thick lines. In a couple areas here, I'm going and putting some cross lines, kind of a perpendicular pattern, just to add a little area of interest. Just like that. And of course, I'm always going back and thickening lines where I see they need thickening. What I'll do later is I'll go back and I'll cross hatch that. And I can't really do that right now because the ink is a little bit wet, So if I drag that nib across, it's going to kind of smear the ink. So I'm just going to let that part dry for a few minutes, and then I'll come back later and I'll cross hatch that. You'll see that happen here in about 5 minutes, I think. And just continuing on with the scales. Notice right here how I'm shaping these scales or scutes to kind of flow with the line of the jaw. And that's a fun thing that you can do with scales, is you can use them to exaggerate or enhance certain features of the animal. So instead of literally drawing the outline of the jaw there, I actually have the scales following that same line. And later on when I ink it, when I put the lines in, it's going to look really cool because I'll have the lines kind of swirling around following the shape of those scales. So other than that shadowed throat there, it's pretty much still outlines at this stage. Throwing in a few smaller, not really scales, it's more of like pebbled skin texture. I think if I were to extend this dragon's neck back, I would probably have the pebbled skin texture and the armor, the scutes, as you see on the head, and then I would probably fade it into scales as I went back into the neck. And I would probably use a different snake or yeah, I'd probably use snake scales as inspiration for that. Twisting and turning the drawing around so I hopefully don't get any more ink on my hand and smear it all over the paper. It actually happens at least once every drawing, I think. And right now what I'm doing is I'm putting some heavy shadow lines on the underside of each scale. Because each scale is rounded. So it's got a lit portion and a shaded portion. Even if that shadow portion is very subtle, I'm still going to call that out with the ink because it gives a nice impression of three-dimensionality and light source. So I'm just following that shadow line up the jaw. See how I'm curving those lines to follow the curve of each individual scale. Right there, I think the pen actually let go of a bunch of ink and it dropped a bunch of ink. And so I just kind of grabbed the ink with the pen and dragged it across the bottom of the scale and made that broad black line. And it worked. Maybe just a little bit more ink than I would have put down otherwise, but it's another one of those things that happens and you just roll with it. Like, okay, how do I use this? So you can see I've got the upper jaw there shaded with a heavier line, and now I'm going in obviously and doing shadow on the tongue. So I could choose to do the whole tongue in solid black because obviously it's in shadow here. But what I'm going to do is this line that I'm drawing right now, I'm going to shade the underside of the tongue below that line, and then the upper half of that tongue I will put kind of a heavy texture in there just to add some variety of texture to this drawing. Since most of it's going to be scales, the tongue offers an ability to have a different kind of texture in there. Here I'm coming in with a watercolor brush. Let's say watercolor brush number 3. So pretty small. Usually if I do brush work, I tend